Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Retain Staff, Maximize Revenue, and Drive Outcomes, Open Minds National Study on Clinical Documentation and Technology. Today's executive web briefing is brought to you by Open Minds and sponsored by Remarkable Health. This afternoon, we are joined by Joe Naughton-Travers, Senior Associate at Open Minds, and Peter Flick, Founder and CEO of Remarkable Health. During our time together, we will discuss the results of the recent Open Minds National Survey on Clinical Documentation Practices and Technology. We'll then dive deeper into the new technology-enabled tools to improve clinical documentation and processes and how they affect consumer experience and staff productivity and retention. You may notice that all attendees have been muted for today's presentation. We are recording today's event, and muting the phone lines assures the highest quality of sound. However, we do encourage you to submit questions via the question box on the GoToWebinar panel at any time throughout the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we will hold a brief question and answer session. Now I will turn the floor over to Joe.
Thank you, Erin. Hey, Peter, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
We're going to start by having me present the initial findings from the survey, and then Peter, I'm going to ask you to come on when we talk about the case study. So you can step off for a moment, and I'm going to show my screen here. The title of our webinar is Retain Staff, Maximize Revenue, and Drive Outcomes, based on the National Study of Clinical Documentation and Technology that we did via survey. So a little bit about what we're going to cover here. The main portion of the presentation today is really to show you the findings from that survey that we just completed over the summer. From there, I'll talk a little bit about the impact of poor documentation for providers, and then a bit about how technology can help us improve clinical documentation. Then my colleague Peter will come on and share a couple of case studies where technology has really helped folks and describe some of the positive results they've gotten from that. So let's talk about the survey itself. The survey was conducted to determine how clinical documentation correlates with revenue and how technology can affect some of the current challenges. We distributed the survey to about 5,000 providers over a time period of about 2 months. And then we did some follow-up calls and outreach to increase the response rate. We got a response rate of 6% and an 85% completion rate on the survey itself. And what we're going to do is present the sort of key findings from the survey and then dive into a bit of detail. So there are 4 key findings from our survey, and they're all listed here on the slide. 20% of respondents say they are looking to buy a new EHR within the next 2 years, but only 11% say they would recommend their current EHR. The second key finding was that over 40% believe that reducing clinical documentation time by 50% would have the biggest impact on their ability to build near full utilization. 65% of the respondents said that their staff spend 7 to 11 hours a week on documentation. The third finding, almost 70% of respondents expressed an interest in purchasing some sort of add-on to their EHR that would help improve clinical documentation issues and make it easier for staff to use. And the last key finding was that filling vacant positions seemed to be the biggest challenge providers identify having impact to their cash flow and profitability. So that's no surprise in particular, as we know that staff vacancies are an issue that much of healthcare is wrestling with. So that's some of the big picture findings. What I'd like to do is to dive into a little more detail about some of the questions and some of the answers we got to them. So the first set of slides here has to do with the average amount of time clinical staff spend on doing documentations and how executives rate their quality, the quality of the documentation itself. So regarding documentation, clinical team members spend an average of 40% of their time documenting their work, which is about 2 days a week. And despite the large investment of time, studies are showing that 15 to 45% of clinical documentation has missing or erroneous information. So people are spending lots of time doing documentation, and it's still problematic. So let's take a look at this slide. The question here has to do with the average number of billable hours per week for the clinical staff. The survey was routed to executives and organizations. And so the pie chart here shows the average number of billable hours for folks that they report. So you can see to the left, the largest percentage is 38%. And 38% of the respondents said they're billing 20 to 26 hours per week. And the rest of the slides are pretty straightforward there, but the rest of the pie wedges, but when you look at it together, 47% of staff are billing 26 hours less or less per week. So that's 20 to 26 at 38%, less than 20 per week at 9%. Very few folks, as you can see on the right side, the orange colored pie pieces, are spending more hours per week. So obviously there's a critical issue about, increasing the productive time of our clinical staff. So we then ask what had the biggest impact on staff's ability to bill at full utilization? And as you can see on the slide, we gave folks 3 primary answers because we thought they were probably key issues. One was to reduce clinical documentation by 50% or more. Another was to use bonus dollars or incentives to increase productivity for staff. And then the third had to do with reducing no-show rates. And you can see the percentages for each of those: 44% for clinical documentation reduction, 13% for using incentives, and 28% for reducing no-shows. Then we also gave the people the option of answering none of the above, and so there were 14% that answered that. But overall, you can see that 44% view reducing clinical documentation time by 50% to be the biggest impact that they could have on full utilization or full productivity for clinical staff. On the next slide, we're talking about the overall time per week that clinical staff actually spend on documentation as reported by the CEOs or the leadership that responded to the survey. And as you can see, looking at the pie slices, at the bottom, 7 to 11 hours per week, 47% of the respondents said their staff are spending 7 to 11 hours, 19% saying 12 to 16, and 9% saying 17 to 20 hours per week, and an amazing 2% actually saying they're spending more than half their time, more than 20 hours, doing documentation. So when you put it all together, roughly 78% of staff are reported to be spending 7 to 20 or more hours a week on doing their documentation. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you actually look at other studies, you would see that clinical staff report spending closer to 40% of their time on documentation. We realized when we did this survey that we were asking primarily leadership and we weren't directly asking clinicians the question about how much time is being spent on documentation. But in either case, you can see a great deal of time is spent on documentation. So any reduction in the time it takes to do clinical documentation and make sure that it's accurate and compliant would help folks have more productive time as far as seeing consumers. The next question had to do with rating the overall quality of the clinical documentation before a quality review. And basically 53% of the respondents said the quality of the clinical record is average or below average. So more than half thought it was okay or just not okay. And then 41% said above average, and only a small 6% said that the documentation was excellent. So this is essentially looking at the perception of how good the documentation is before a quality review has been done. After we started to get the survey results, what we wished we had asked is the question that's at the bottom of the slide, which is how much time are your quality and compliance staff spending actually doing clinical documentation reviews to bring up the standards of your clinical documentation. So the next set of findings have to do with the factors that have the greatest impact on growing revenue, profitability, and cash flow to provider agencies. And in this instance, they were given 4 key answers and the option to answer all of the above. And as you can see, the largest response, 43%, was to all of the above. Staff positions being filled and operational within 30 days of startup, staff billing near full utilization, to bill services within 24 hours, and to reduce staff turnover. So those all combined were described as the key issues impacting organizations' ability to grow revenues, maximize revenues, profitability, and cash flow. As you can see, only 5% answered none of the above. In the next section, we asked some questions about how satisfied people were with their electronic health record and whether they were likely to make changes or look for add-on products that could help them with clinical documentation in particular. So let me review those results with you. So the first had to do with, are you going to change software? And interestingly, 26% said that they're looking for a new EHR in the coming months. Coming 24 months, and about 75% said they were not. So a quarter of the respondents essentially say they do plan to look at an entire new EHR. Then we asked the question about add-on products. It's one of the things that Remarkable Health does, is would they be interested in finding out about an add-on product to their EHR that could help them with clinical documentation? So the question itself was true or false. Your organization would evaluate purchasing an EHR add-on product that improved clinical documentation issues, such as efficiency, staff time, and quality of the notes, and was easier for staff to use. 70% of the respondents, remember these are the executives, said they certainly would consider an add-on product. So I find that sort of interesting, and we'll talk to Peter about that when we get to the Q&A piece, because roughly a quarter of folks were looking to change their EHR, meaning 75% were not changing their EHR, but a whole bunch of folks said, well, you know what, we would look at doing an add-on product to our current EHR. So this slide has a lot on it. Let me explain it. This is that 10-point question we often get in our own personal lives, rating something on a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 is I would absolutely refer my, my family members to this, or I was absolutely pleased with the customer service. So 10 is the high score, and 0 is the low score. It's called the Net Promoter Score. And again, the respondents answer on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being really good. And if you look at the chart on the right side, the way you evaluate Net Promoter Score for whatever you're using it for is to divide the results into promoters, those who answer 9 or 10. The broad notion is if you're, these are the folks that are really happy with whatever the question's about and are likely to be promoters. Answers 7 or 8 are considered sort of in the middle. They're considered passive. And then 0 through 6 are considered detractors, folks that would work against us, if this were, satisfaction with our services or our products. And so these are the actual survey results from our survey, and we summarize them on the left side. That 11% of the folks that responded would fall into the promoter category, that they were really likely to recommend their EHR, and they scored it a 9 or a 10. 47% fell into that passive category, scoring their EHR in terms of recommendations as a 7 or 8. And then a whopping 42% fell into the detractor category, where they scored the likelihood to recommend their EHR from 0 to 6. So again, going back to a previous slide, 26% of respondents said they are looking to buy a new EHR in the next 2 years, but only 11% would actually recommend a current electronic health record. So it tells you a lot about what's going on in our industry in terms of satisfaction with an electronic health record, in terms of overall use as well as clinical documentation. So what does this really mean for providers when we look at these survey results? Agencies report that staff are spending too much time on documentation, and this is obviously impacting productivity, which affects unit costs, and the quality of clinical documentation. Only 11% would recommend their current EHR, as we mentioned. 26% of the executives are looking to replace their EHR over the next 24 months, and 70% are actually open to looking for a clinical documentation product that they can layer on top of their existing EHR to improve productivity and clinical documentation itself. All right, so let's move on to my next two sections, in the impact of poor documentation for providers. So many of these things would be obvious to you. The first is the challenges in onboarding new staff. The notion here is that if an EHR takes a lot longer for us to do clinical documentation, or it's not helping folks do their documentation, it can take longer to train staff and get them up and running. And if you remember, one of the earlier survey results talked specifically about getting staff trained and up and running in less than 30 days. The second thing is that less time is spent on consumer care, and actually it can result in poor care coordination. So if I'm spending 25 hours a week doing clinical documentation, I'm obviously spending less time with the consumers I serve. And if I'm actually part of a clinical team that is providing care to an individual consumer, the fact that I have poor documentation may impact what other providers are doing, because they don't have a clear information about the services that I've delivered or the things I've been, that I should be recording in my clinical notes. The other thing that can result from, issues with poor documentation are staff morale, with clinicians just getting really frustrated with using the system and it affecting their jobs. I'm actually doing work for a customer on the West Coast that actually has this as a problem now. A number of nurses and direct care staff are actually leaving the agency because there are significant problems with their current EHR in terms of staff being able to efficiently document and completely document the services that they deliver. So it not only can affect staff morale, but it actually can affect staff retention if there are significant issues there. So if we have poor documentation, obviously we're likely to spend more time on compliance and quality reviews of the records. This is where our QA staff or our compliance staff are actually reviewing the records, and then the staff members themselves needing to go back and correct poor or incomplete documentation. Revenue leakage, that's sort of a billing and AR term, but the broad notion here is if we have poor documentation, we may not bill all the services that we're eligible to bill, and so that reduces our revenues organizationally. So if we have insufficient or lack of documentation or poor documentation, it may actually impact whether we can actually bill the services so that we get paid for them. And then lastly, when payers come in to audit our charts, if we have poor documentation, we could actually have our dollars recouped by the payers. So obviously there's a lot of risk with poor or incomplete documentation for the services we deliver. So what I'd like to talk about briefly, and then I'm actually going to pull Peter on so he can talk about some case studies, is how technology can really help with clinical documentation. So the first thing has to do with having an electronic health record or add-on that allows us to have a disconnected mobile solution. So many of you may have the ability to use your EHR on a mobile device, such as a cell phone or a tablet computer. But then the question becomes, can you do that when you don't have access to internet or cellular service? So I call that a disconnected mobile solution, where you can go out in the field, you do not need to be connected to the internet or have cellular access. You can have the records that you need on your device, and you can actually begin recording your clinical documentation. So that's a disconnected solution, and I'm seeing, certainly in my work at Open Minds, a very strong demand for this, particularly as payers continue to push us for more community and home-based services. So that's one way that clinical technology can help us, because it allows staff to actually do recording or at least take notes while they're in the field, and that they don't have to wait till they get back to the office to begin their clinical documentation. The second area where technology can help us is what's called clinical decision support. You know, the notion that we would have a smart system, an EHR or an add-on product, that helps folks with their treatment planning and documentation. So for example, there may be documentation templates built into the software. It may tell us the components we should have in a progress note, for instance, so that people document them, or the components we would need to have in an evaluation and management and E&M, a service code to make sure that doctors and other are fully documenting what is needed. Additionally, there is some ability for EHRs or add-on products to actually help with diagnostics and treatment planning. You know, there are some vendors who have loaded, for instance, Wiley treatment planning in libraries into their system, so that can aid people in picking treatment goals. Additionally, software often prompts clinical staff to report on the progress towards individual goals or objectives while they're doing their documentation. And also in some instances, it can actually support us using evidence-based practices and monitoring fidelity. So we're seeing more and more in that in terms of what EHRs can do for folks and any add-on products. But what I'd really like to lead to is some of the new stuff that is really beginning to move into our market. And that's the broad notion of using artificial intelligence. You know, so this is moving beyond just the clinical decision support that I described in the previous slide, but using artificial intelligence as part of our EHR or add-on product that aids clinicians even more. So Peter's going to talk a bit about this more when he talks about his case studies, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about that really exists in the marketplace right now. One is that technology that allows in the moment data capture for clinical staff. You know, the ability to record voice and translate it to text if I'm in the field and want to capture some notes I'll need for documentation, or if I've scribbled down my notes, the ability to capture that via photo and then use that later to create my clinical documentation, and automatic text expansion, where I can use more cryptic words and have it expand the text using artificial intelligence. Going beyond that, technology can actually help write drafts of clinical documentation from the captured notes to put it together as a draft so that clinicians can edit it and finalize it. And then finally, there's even the ability for artificial intelligence to aid in writing the notes that are compliant with clinical standards and payer and agency requirements, to actually look for the things that need to be part of the documentation and to alert clinicians of those things. So that technology is actually available and obviously can help folks in not only documenting more quickly, but documenting in a way that is compliant with our internal clinical standards as well as what payers or other regulating agencies may require us to do. So that's sort of the big picture of the survey findings, the challenges with poor documentation and its impact on providers, and then some of the ways that technology can help providers improve their clinical documentation and save time for their clinical staff. So I'd like my colleague Peter to come on now. And Peter, you can say hello.
Hello. Hey, Joe, thank you for that. That was this working with the Open Minds team on this survey has been an excellent experience, and you always bring such a high quality of thought leadership. So we're really excited to partner with you on this topic, which I think is important. I think before we go into the case studies, it's probably helpful to for me to talk about really how this came about for us to even get to these case studies, and a lot of the key points that we validated in this survey were really learnings that we had as being, you know, in addition to being the CEO of Remarkable Health, which is predominantly an EHR, behavioral health, Medicaid focused EHR software company. We got to learn. I'm a product guy in addition to being the CEO, and as a product person, we really sat back about 3 years ago and really started to interview deeply customers. And we know from our experience sort of how EHRs have evolved in physical health and in dental, which has been, there has emerged an ecosystem of bolt-on software products that really enhance and amplify what staff can do. And so we started to put significant resources around a couple key initiatives. One was we wanted to focus on putting a significant portion of our R&D into products that could amplify and bolt on to the EHR, specifically for Medicaid, behavioral health, and human service providers. And then we sat back and said, well, if we could do one thing that could have the biggest impact, what would it be? And we really anchored on the fact that there's massive amount of demand for services, but the supply of providers is the biggest point of constriction right now. And this was really before COVID, before the Great Recession. There was a staffing issue for the Medicaid behavioral health providers. And so we said, well, anything we do, it needs to help make it easier to onboard new staff and help drive retention of existing staff. And then we dug further and we talked to staff and said, you know, tell us about the parts of your job that you love, and tell us about the parts of your job that you don't love as much. And documentation kept coming up, and we've yet to find someone that said, I got into this because I love documentation. It's not to say documentation isn't super critical to delivering excellent care, but when you find out that folks are spending 40% of their time or 2 days a week on documentation, they're often doing it after hours, and the quality is still an issue, you sort of start to scratch your head and say, hey, maybe there's something here. And you know, we looked at we have a ton of data, we have a ton of users that we can talk to, and we had a couple key metrics that made us feel strongly that we were onto a good problem to solve, which was the average time from when a session occurs to when a note is signed is 3.5 days. That folks tend to do their progress notes in some ways the way our team does expense reports, sort of at the last moment when someone is running a report. It's very common. So people are running reports saying, hey, Cindy, you need to get your note in. Bob, you need to get your note in. And then checking, did they get their notes in? And then once they're in, they're getting reviewed by supervisors. They're getting reviewed by QA. And onboarding staff in terms of how to write a good note is not the easiest thing in the world. There's a lot of nuance to making sure that the narrative of your note is in line with your credentials and is in line with the agency's guidelines. And so it was kind of a funny story. I had just returned from a business trip to Kansas where we have a lot of customers, and I was really sort of immersed in this problem, right? I was living in the problem, not the solution at this point in the process. And when I came home to a family dinner, and we have a tradition in our family where we go around the table and we do high lows. And my daughter Isabella had her low was that she got a poor grade on a paper for school because she had some spelling and grammar errors. And I was quick to say, oh, there's this tool called Grammarly. And if you use that, you probably would have gotten a better grade. And like, you could use that next time. And I was expecting a thank you. And she was not appreciative. And then it got to me, Joe, and I said, you know, it's so frustrating as I talk to these users that they all made a decision to work with the Medicaid population, an underserved population. And as a result, they're having to jump through more documentation hoops than they would if they were on the private pay side. And it doesn't seem right, and they have to write certain notes in a certain way. And my daughter sort of flippantly turned to me and said, well, Dad, if you're so smart, why don't you create a Grammarly for them? And a light bulb went off, and we started to innovate the way we innovate, which was get on the phone the next day to a couple of our CEOs that we work very closely with and say, what do you think about this idea? And the idea was essentially create a product that could bolt onto the EHR, or layer onto an existing EHR, whether it's our EHR or someone else's, and create a really optimized note-taking experience for Medicaid, behavioral health, and human service providers. And that was the general idea, and have it act like Grammarly, where the system could make recommendations as someone is writing their note and make the whole thing easier. And so we did deep partnership. And we really let our customers, and I'm going to share two case studies in a second, of two customers that we work very closely with. There were many more, but two in particular. And what we learned is that in order to really solve, like our North Star goal was, what if we could take the 2 days folks are spending on documentation and cut it to 1 day? Well, if we could do that, we could create 20% capacity for the industry. And that would be pretty magnificent. And what we could also do is take this pain point of these providers, say, I love helping people, but I don't love having to write down everything I did in a way that the insurance company is going to sort of validate. And so if you can make that easier and I can still provide excellent care, then that's a win-win. And so we had a couple design principles in the product. We learned that folks, they want a mobile device, but they want mobile to consume information. They don't want to use mobile to create all their notes. So they want to start on mobile and finish on a keyboard-driven device. That was one learning we had. The other was that mobile solution needs to be able to work disconnected. And you hit on that, right? A lot of our folks are in schools, prisons, community areas that don't have great internet connectivity. So we need a way for them to get access to the information they need and not put any barrier to them getting from session to sign time. And so we made sure our mobile solution was disconnected, which is a big win. The next thing we sort of learned from talking to folks is we have this concept of a scribble in the note, where they have this safe place where they can document and prepare for sessions or capture information in the 2 minutes right after a session. So we want to encourage users to start the documentation process very quickly, get it out of your head and into a HIPAA secure place that's tied to the client. But you don't have to write your note right away, because most folks are not doing concurrent documentation. And so instead, in our solution that we created with some customers, it allows them to quickly jot down information, snap a picture of their handwritten notes, voice to text to get their information in there, and then say, Bells, create a draft note for me that I can work on later. And Bells, we named the product after my daughter Bells. I call Isabella Bells, and that was kind of a fun part of it. My boys don't love it, but you know, there's more products to create, so maybe they'll get lucky someday. But essentially, they can then get to their desktop device and they can go write their notes. And we have speed tools built in, and where we use artificial intelligence is agencies have a pretty detailed orientation training plan for new staff. These are verbs we like to use for this type of service. These are verbs you can't use for this type of service because it would connotate that you're offering service at a higher level than you're credentialed for. And there's a lot of nuance to that. And so we were able to use a natural language processing engine to, in a friendly way, recommend and enforce the rules that the agency wants to enforce while they're writing the note, as opposed to waiting till QA is trying to fix it after the fact. And the results have been pretty amazing, kind of like across the board, both for direct service providers, to supervisors, to the QA staff, to the executive staff. And we could go to two of the case study examples right now and share some of their specific results that I think the community
Sure.
might appreciate.
So I'm gonna pop off camera, Peter. And just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions as Peter and I are talking, just put them in the questions panel. I'm gonna pop off camera and pull the slides up for you, Peter, and just let me know when you need me to change them.
Sure.
And you should see the first case
Yeah.
study.
Great. So Wings Children and Families. This is an agency in Maine. Great organization. What's unique about them is they just do case management. So they have a very specialized focus, which is really not the norm. For a lot of our customers offer a variety of services, but they're very specialized. And as we started to identify this problem, we went to them and said, listen, we'd like to talk to you about documentation. And we found out a couple things, that, with case management, you can typically provide case management in small increments of time, sometimes 6 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes. So they could do an activity for 6 minutes that's a case management activity, but it would take 10 minutes to write a note. And often folks were not documenting. It wasn't a one-to-one for everything they did that they were documenting. And this was a thesis that we had. And sort of globally, not necessarily specific to Wings, but a thesis that we had. What we did hear from Wings is, from case management, they have a ton of volume, and notes are a challenge. They're bringing folks in. Often they might be pulling someone in from a service job, like working at Starbucks or some other place in the community. They're coming into an environment they've never done this before. They get trained on how to be a case manager, but now for the first time in their life, they have a job where they have to document everything they did, and it has to be done in a certain way that will pass an audit by an insurance company. And that's a really new aspect of any type of job. And so we worked with Trish, the CEO, executive director of Wings, Sue Amero, the operations manager, and we shared with them our framework. We started working with them, meeting with them weekly in Q1, and it went, so we launched it first with 20 users in Q1, 20 of their staff, and it worked so well that they decided, we're going to roll this out to everyone, and we're going to do it at once, and in less than 30 days rolled it out to their entire organization. And it was a win from a morale perspective with staff. They said, we heard things like, I used to have to stay at work another hour and a half instead of, and now I can leave at 5 because I'm caught up on my notes because this tool makes it so much faster to do it. And then other things like, now I understand what you were coaching me on in terms of certain nomenclature in the note. And it was just a huge win. And so specifically, we rolled it out to their whole organization, and the impact was better than we expected. We reduced the session to sign time by 67%, from 45 hours to 15 hours. So the average time from a session to a signing. We improved the note writing time it got 72% faster. And so we measure specifically from when they open the note to when they complete the note, and compare that to the baseline of that same cohort without using bells on an EHR system. And then was really interesting and got Trish's attention and their board's attention was the average, I'll just use the term DSP, wrote 6 more notes a week, and that was a 15% increase. And then across the board, based on how their mix of programs, that same cohort increased their revenue per DSP by 30% a week. So by each person, on average, 30% more per week of productivity. And so probably in the form of maybe there were some activities being done before that they weren't actually had a 1-for-1 for their notes, and then also seeing more people as a result of spending less time on documentation. And then you have the retention layer, right? So still too early to see how this is impacting their long-term employee retention, but the early indications and the speed with which staff adopted the tool are having all of us feel like this, like staff felt like this was a raise by getting this technology. And so we were really grateful to work with Wings. They were awesome to work with, and to be able to do a bunch of hard work over several quarters and then launch it and see these results so quickly was really impressive. We can move on to the next case study, Joe. Okay, so this one is MHA of South Central Kansas. Mary Jones is the executive director. We worked very closely with this organization, and Mary in particular is a clinician by training and still does see folks. In addition to being the CEO and executive director of the organization, Mary was very instrumental in a lot of the rules that we created from an AI perspective. And so what we did in MHA's case is we got all of their orientation materials, like specifically what are the materials that you're training staff on, and then we worked with their QA team to pull all the notes that had some issue over some period of time, and we codified and we cross-referenced what they're training on and then errors that are coming up in the notes, and we created a master list of rules that we'd like to catch. And we had over 20 sort of types of rules and different versions of those rules. We were able to, I think about 15 of those rules, we were able to build with our NLP AI engine and using other sort of overlay technology on top of that to be able to catch those rules in the moment. What was really hard about this is the software needs to understand the context. So in a certain case, I think in their particular case, they didn't want to use, staff would say, I helped someone do this. And what comes back from the payers is, we don't want you to be helping them. We want you to be assisting or demonstrating or supporting, but not help. If we're just helping them, they're always going to need the help. But the way staff think about it often is they're used to using, hey, let me help you with that. Can I give you a hand? And so we built in a rule that would understand if it was the actual, like who is the actor in the sentence and who is the person being acted upon, to understand if some version of the word help is being used and any tense of the word help, that we could then recommend assist or support it. And that's how like that rule in particular worked. And so now Bells is encouraging and training folks in the moment and also improving the quality of the note. And so those were the kinds of things where we really dug in and built nuance that is really specific to how MCOs are looking at notes in this environment, and be able to dial that in. And a certain agency has multiple MCOs that are looking at maybe slightly different things. They can dial in Bells so that Bells is enforcing certain rules in certain situations, which is really powerful. And so with MHA, we decided to break it into 3 waves. We decided of their staff, let's focus on the early adopters, the adopters, and the technology laggards, and then use the momentum of the early adopters to sort of by word of mouth, let the adopters and the technology laggers that don't like change, let them know how much time it's saving them, and sort of share some of their own personal stories of, I've started taking yoga now because I get to leave work an hour and a half earlier than I used to, and I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I'm more refreshed for my clients when I see them. And so that worked really well in that case. And in terms of impact and metrics, what we saw is a 50% reduction in their session to sign time. So they were shortening that, which allowed them to submit claims faster, which helped with cash flow. An improvement in the note writing time of about the same 50%. And that on average, the DSPs wrote 28% more notes a week, which in their case translated so far, in the observation period, of a 16% revenue increase on average for the DSPs each week. And so again, this was a huge win for when you think about it's easier for new staff. It's easier for existing staff that still don't love writing notes and would like to spend more time face to face with a client than actually in the system writing a note. The revenue, they're helping more people, so access to care is improving, and then the revenue, which is the lifeblood of a lot of these nonprofit agencies. And so in Mary's case in particular, we worked with Mary and Bailey Blair, who was one of her key executives on this project. What they also noted is, staffing is a challenge for them. They have a lot of open positions. They're trying to onboard staff, and a lot of times they don't hire people because they don't feel confident that they might be great at delivering care, but when it comes to their writing skills, that's going to be a challenge. And so they've shared that they feel that they can actually widen the funnel of folks that they're looking at, because they now have this tool that could be an ally to them, and that's pretty empowering. Bailey said, I have one provider in particular. She's not a strong writer, but she's excellent in her work, and her best work never gets reflected in her writing. And this tool now has leveled the playing field. So now folks that may have not had a certain education are able to perform at a level that their peers who had better education are able to perform, because their actual client facing work is excellent. And then in also what Mary shared there is it's taken their average ramp time for a new hire would be 6 weeks to get them to bill at full utilization. And with Bells, they can now do it in 3 weeks, which is excellent, right? Because if you get people up and running quicker, you're going to lower the chance that they fail to launch and they stay for 90 days and then leave. So those are just two examples. We got a lot more, but wanted to share them, and thought that they dovetail very nicely into the data that Open Minds pulled together.
Thank you, Peter. To our audience members, I have to move my slides around here so I can see everyone. Go ahead and put any questions in the question box. We have about 10 minutes for Peter and I to answer questions for you. I did have just one thing to start, Peter. People don't realize that they're already using artificial intelligence in their own life a lot as it is. They don't think of Siri or our Apple, our Amazon devices as artificial intelligence. Have you run into folks that are, concerned about, is a robot writing the clinical notes kind of question?
Right. Yeah. So, sometimes people ask that question, right? And I think, I would have asked those questions if I'm not in this space. So, AI is a pretty broad range of science where you're using data and contextual situations to make recommendations. And so we are not in any case, in any event, writing the note. I think the way I would explain it to my sister, who's not very, technically savvy, is it's sort of like maps, right? With maps, I can pick my location, where I want to go, and it can track where I am at and say, hey, this is where we want you to go, but this is where you are. So here's how you go left, right. And, you know, in a way, we're using specifically natural language processing to understand what someone is writing, to understand the context, to then make a recommendation based on the agency's rules and guidelines. And what's nice about that is if a payer makes a change, then the agency can just go into the system and say, hey, now if we're doing this, we want the system to behave this way. So we're not forcing anyone. No one has to take the suggestions. What we're really doing is Bells, in this case, is using natural language processing to play the role that a supervisor or a QA person could play if they were actually reading the note and sitting next to them while they were writing it. And what it's done, interestingly enough, is it's actually improved care because it's allowed supervisors to take the amount of time they're spending on coaching people on how to write a note from here to here. And now they're filling it with, let's talk about how you're doing the treatment plan. Let's talk about like how this client is showing up and how we can improve, how you might be able to, you show up differently as a clinician to help them get to a better outcome quicker.
So it's not a robot.
There's no robots. There's no robots.
It's not a robot. And I forgot, Aaron, my colleague, could you come on and help me with questions? Because I know we're getting a bunch of questions in our chat box. So I have to help Peter give the short answers if we're going to answer all these questions.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, feel free to say.
Is it a robot? No.
Okay, yes, sorry.
So what else do we have, Aaron?
Great. I have a question for Peter. We implemented an EHR 2 years ago and are not ready to replace it. Is Bells something we could add to our existing EHR?
Yes, Joe is the short answer. We built Bells to be EHR agnostic, and so we're obviously we have a tight integration with our EHR, but we've also built it and are talking to folks about applying it to situations where they have another EHR and they just want to enhance the experience, but they're maybe overall happy with their current EHR. So yes, that is an option.
And I'm seeing another question, Aaron, from Nicholas. And this is closer to my robot question. How do we ensure personalized care for our clients when using this kind of predictive or assistive technology?
So that's a great question. Personalized care is you are providing care how you want. This is a question of how you document the personalized care that you're providing, and the rules that Bells is helping to facilitate. Like half of what Bells does is help facilitate enforcing certain quality. Half of it is helping you just capture information faster and more efficiently. But on the quality side, these are rules that the QA team and the supervisors are enforcing anyways. So it's actually sort of blending personal care with agency guidelines and having more consistency across the board.
Very good. Aaron, what else are you seeing in questions from our audience here?
Here's one. The data about whether respondents would recommend their EHR to others surprises even me. I mean, only 11% are labeled promoters in the NPS scores. What do you attribute this EHR dissatisfaction to?
Well, I don't know if you want to answer that, Joe. I have some thoughts, but I mean, I'm an EHR vendor. I'll give you my quick thoughts.
Everyone hates their EHR.
Well, I think, look, here's the deal. EHRs were built at a time when, in the 90s, when everyone, the thought of technology was, let's just take our paper process and put it online. And EHRs are like 10 products together if you really break it apart. And so they're monolithic by nature. They're far-reaching. I think they are excellent products. They do the work of 20 to 30 people, but they were built for the agency. And I think we need apps like what we talked about, Bells, and other apps that can bolt on, that can really use more modern technology to leverage all the rich data that's in the EHR. I think EHRs will always be here, but I think what we're going to see is more a sort of wider, more richer tech stack that enhances the experience and sort of puts people with what they're used to today. Like Bells, we built on the same framework that Facebook's built on. It's got a really modern user experience. You can't just take a 10-year-old EHR that's has invested tens of millions of dollars and just use and just lift that over to modern technology. So I think that's part of it. But Joe, you have a lot of experience too.
Yeah, well, I must say that the 11% did surprise me, though, that only 11% would actually recommend their EHR. So, I hear people grumpy about their EHRs a lot, and a lot of people change vendors, but, I was still surprised at that level of dissatisfaction. Now, we are getting a whole lot of questions here,
Yeah.
Peter, that have to do with, okay, if I want to add it on, can it tack on to my EHR? Can it tack on to any EHR? Is it actually integrated? So I can't read all the questions, but that's sort of the notion. Can this kind of AI technology and mobile stuff be tacked on?
Yeah, I think if you have a meaningful use 3 product that requires open APIs, that we would, we can talk to you about how in your given situation that we could integrate with that EHR to be able to pull information and share information back to the EHR so you could do your notes that way. So yes, it happens all the time.
And now I'm having a question from someone who must be in the QA department. They're terrified their jobs are going to disappear. Do you see artificial intelligence as, replacing the need for quality and compliance review by our staff in those departments?
No, I don't. I think if you talk to most QA folks, what they'd say is they're only able to scratch the surface, and this is finally given the QA folks technology to allow them to really amplify what they're able to do in an organization and actually be able to spend more time on driving higher quality rather than policing sort of low quality work is what I would expect.
Yeah, I would agree, because the things you've talked about, the technology helping us with is really a lot of what I would call the compliance issues, following the rules, making sure the documentation meets the requirements. And most QA departments I've spoken to are spending the vast majority of their time doing that and not real quality improvement or quality management. So I would argue for Gabrielle and our audience that it would allow you to do the quality work and spend less time on doing the widgety compliance work. Let me see, Stephanie here. I'm just going to read. I hear all the time in my job that outpatient behavioral health is a money loss, so I'm excited to hear the case studies where there's improvement in revenues. But those are outpatient facilities or ambulatory services. Has this technology been used in other settings like residential or inpatient?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have customers that are, we have existing remarkable health customers that have a myriad of residential, inpatient, and outpatient. So if they're writing notes and they're documenting it, then this can improve their experience, both in speed, user experience, and then quality.
Okay, so it just happened that your case studies were focused a little more on ambulatory, but the technology can be used in other settings.
Yeah.
Well, very good. We're coming to the end of our time here, Aaron. So Peter, before Aaron does the close off for us, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to work with you and the team, and to our audience, thank you for attending. We still have a whole slew of folks sitting in the room with us, Peter, virtually. So Peter, thanks again, and I'm going to turn it over to Aaron.
Thank you. Also, I just wanted to say that if this information did resonate with you, you can visit www.bells.com Okay. 1 second. And thank you everybody for joining. It looks like we're about out of time.
Thank
We had a
you.
great
Thank you all.
turnout. Thank you all for joining us for Retain Staff, Maximize Revenue, Drive Outcomes, Open Minds National Study on Clinical Documentation and Technology, brought to you by Remarkable Health and Open Minds. As a reminder, all participants will receive an email in the next few days containing a link which will allow you to download a PDF copy of the presentation and listen to a recording of today's presentation. Have a wonderful day.
Take care. Be well all.
Thanks.
Thanks.